Charlotte Hayes loved the quiet mornings of Crestwood Heights. After nearly 2 years deployed overseas, the serene suburban streets felt like a world apart from the chaos she had left behind. Now back home, she was determined to reclaim her routine, starting with her daily jogs. Dressed in a simple black tracksuit and old running shoes, her curly hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun, Charlotte looked like any other jogger. But the lean strength in her stride and the sharpness in her eyes hinted at her years of military service. The morning seemed perfect until she noticed something unusual. Ahead, a man in a dark hoodie fumbled with the front door of a house. He glanced around nervously, his hands working at the lock. Charlotte slowed her pace, her instincts flaring. As she got closer, it became clear. The man wasn't a homeowner. He was breaking in. Charlotte's training kicked in. She immediately stepped to the side, pulling out her phone to call the police. But before she could finish dialing, a loud voice erupted from a speaker near the door. "I see you on camera. The police are on their way. Get out of my house." The man jerked upright, his head swiveling in panic. Then he bolted, sprinting down the street. Without hesitation, Charlotte took off after him. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. The man glanced back, his face pale with fear. But he didn't stop. Instead, he zigzagged through the neighborhood, hoping to lose her. Charlotte kept her pace steady, her breathing controlled. Years of military conditioning gave her an edge. No matter how hard he ran, she stayed on his heels. "You're not getting away," she growled, her voice carrying across the empty streets. The chase led to a narrow alley where the man, realizing he couldn't outrun her, skidded to a stop. He turned, breathing heavily, and pulled a small knife from his pocket. "Stay back!" he yelled, waving the blade. "I'm warning you!" Charlotte paused, her eyes scanning the scene. A broken branch lay nearby. She quickly picked it up, gripping it firmly. "Put the knife down," she ordered, her voice calm but commanding. "The police are on their way. There's no escape." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the street behind her. For a moment it seemed he might surrender. Then in a burst of desperation, he lunged forward. Charlotte sidestepped the attack, using the branch to deflect his swing. She spun and delivered a precise kick to his leg, sending him sprawling to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, dropping the knife in the process, and sprinted away. Charlotte considered chasing him but stopped when the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. She bent down to pick up the knife, intending to explain everything to the arriving officers. But as the patrol car screeched to a halt and 2 officers jumped out, their focus was immediately on her, standing in the alley, holding a knife. "Drop the weapon and put your hands up," shouted Officer Brian Matthews, his hand already on the grip of his gun. Charlotte froze, realizing the misunderstanding brewing before her. "Wait," she said, dropping the knife and raising her hands. "I'm not the criminal. I was chasing him. He ran that way." But Matthews didn't listen. His partner, Officer Rachel Turner, hesitated, her gaze flickering between Charlotte and the discarded knife. "Drop to your knees now," Matthews barked, his tone filled with suspicion. Charlotte's heart raced. She had faced countless dangers on the battlefield, but this was different. This was home, and somehow she was the enemy. Charlotte Hayes knelt on the cold pavement, her hands raised above her head. Despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins, she kept her voice steady. "I'm Colonel Charlotte Hayes, United States Army. I'm not the one you're looking for. I was trying to stop a burglar." Officer Brian Matthews, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a hardened expression, stepped closer. His hand rested firmly on the grip of his gun, his eyes scanning her like a predator, sizing up prey. "Colonel, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't exactly look like a soldier in that tracksuit." "Nice try." Charlotte gritted her teeth, fighting the frustration bubbling inside her. She had faced life-threatening situations in war zones, but this was a humiliation she hadn't expected, being treated as a criminal in her own country. "If you'll allow me to reach into my bag, I can show you my ID," she said, keeping her tone calm despite the mounting tension. Matthew's hand tightened on his weapon. "Don't move," he barked. "You think I'm stupid? You're not pulling anything out of that bag." "Brian, maybe we should check what she's saying," Officer Rachel Turner interjected hesitantly. Rachel was shorter, with soft features that betrayed her unease. Her hand hovered near her holster, but she hadn't drawn her weapon. "She doesn't look like a threat." Matthews glared at her. I've seen plenty of cases like this, Rachel. Don't let her fool you. Charlotte took a slow breath. Officer, you're making a mistake. My papers are in my bag. If you just... On the ground, Matthews interrupted, his voice rising. Now! Reluctantly, Charlotte complied. She lowered herself onto the pavement, her knees scraping against the rough surface. Her hands remained visible, fingers splayed to show she posed no threat. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Matthews and Charlotte. Brian, we should wait for backup. The captain will know what to do. Matthews didn't budge. His hand was already on his firearm, his body language rigid with distrust. We don't need the captain, he snapped. I've got this under control. Charlotte stared up at him, her eyes blazing. You're acting out of prejudice, she said, her voice calm but pointed. And you will be held accountable for this. Matthews let out a cold laugh. Prejudice? That's rich. You're the one holding a knife at the scene of a break-in. I was chasing the burglar, Charlotte shot back, her patience wearing thin. I had him cornered, but he escaped before you got here. Matthews shook his head, unwilling to listen. Sure you were. Now stand up, slowly. Charlotte began to rise, moving carefully to avoid any sudden motions. But as she adjusted her footing, Matthews' suspicion boiled over. Don't try anything, he shouted, drawing his gun and pointing it directly at her. Rachel's eyes widened in alarm. Brian, what are you doing? She's unarmed. She's resisting, Matthews barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his assumptions. Charlotte froze, her body stiffening as the gun barrel remained fixed on her. Her mind raced, weighing her options. Any movement could escalate the situation further. Listen to me, Charlotte said evenly, her eyes locked on Matthews. I am not a threat. If you just let me show you. The sound of a gunshot shattered the air. A sharp pain tore through Charlotte's leg, sending her crumpling to the ground. Blood seeped through her tracksuit, staining the pavement beneath her. Rachel screamed, Brian, what have you done? Matthews stepped back, his face pale but his demeanor unrepentant. She moved. I had to act, he muttered defensively, holstering his weapon. Charlotte gritted her teeth, her hand instinctively moving to her wounded leg. She refused to let the pain consume her. Instead, she fixed Matthews with a piercing glare. You just made the worst mistake of your career, she hissed, her voice trembling with controlled fury. At that moment, a police SUV screeched to a halt at the end of the alley. The door flew open, and Police Chief Edward Collins stepped out. A stocky man in his 50s with a graying beard, Collins radiated authority as he strode toward the scene. What the hell is going on here? Collins demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Matthews straightened, his expression hardening. Sir, I caught this suspect at the scene of a break-in. She resisted, so I had to use force. Collins' sharp eyes landed on Charlotte, who lay on the ground clutching her bleeding leg. Recognition flickered across his face. Wait a minute, he said, his tone shifting. That's Colonel Charlotte Hayes. What the hell have you done, Matthews? Matthews blinked, his composure faltering. She was holding a knife. And you didn't bother to check her identity? Collins roared. She's a decorated officer in the United States Army. Matthews' face turned ashen. Collins crouched beside Charlotte, his voice softening. Colonel Hayes, I'm so sorry for this. I'll make sure this is handled properly. Charlotte nodded weakly, her voice firm despite her pain. Handle it right, Chief. This can't happen again. Charlotte Hayes lay on a hospital stretcher, her face pale but her eyes still holding the steely determination of a soldier. The flashing lights of the ambulance bathed the narrow streets in a rhythmic red glow as paramedics worked to stabilize her leg. Police Chief Edward Collins sat beside her, his face heavy with regret. You'll be all right, Colonel, Collins said quietly. But I swear, what happened out there won't go unanswered. Charlotte nodded, biting back the pain that radiated from her injured leg. Make sure it doesn't, she replied, her voice steady. This isn't just about me. It's about what's broken in your department. By the time Charlotte was wheeled into the hospital, the story had already begun to spread. A bystander had filmed the aftermath of the incident, capturing Charlotte lying injured on the ground, while Officer Brian Matthews argued with Chief Collins. The video, shared online, quickly went viral. The next morning, news outlets ran headlines like, Decorated Army officer shot by police in apparent misunderstanding. Racial bias in law enforcement. How did this happen to Colonel Hayes? Social media exploded with outrage. Advocacy groups, including civil rights organizations and veterans associations, quickly joined the conversation. The hashtag #Justice for Colonel Hayes trended nationwide. "This incident is a disgrace," one prominent veteran tweeted. "Charlotte Hayes dedicated her life to protecting this country, and this is how she's treated?" Protests erupted outside the Crestwood Police Department. Crowds held signs reading, "Accountability now," and "Stop racism in policing." The tension was palpable, and the department faced mounting pressure to respond swiftly. Chief Collins wasted no time. That afternoon, he called an emergency press conference. "Today, we face an incident that should never have happened," he began, his voice firm. "I want to publicly acknowledge the unacceptable actions of Officer Brian Matthews during the encounter with Colonel Charlotte Hayes. Effective immediately, Officer Matthews is suspended without pay, pending a full investigation." Collins paused, glancing at the cameras. "I have also requested assistance from the FBI to ensure that this case is handled with transparency and integrity. Colonel Hayes deserves justice, and this department will not hide from accountability." The announcement only fueled public debate. Some praised Collins for acting decisively, while others questioned how such an incident could occur in the first place. Within days, the FBI launched a formal investigation into the incident. Agent Sarah Whitaker, a seasoned investigator known for her meticulous approach, led the team. Surveillance footage from the alley was reviewed, showing the moments leading up to and following the gunshot. It clearly depicted Charlotte dropping the knife and complying with commands before Matthews escalated the situation. Agent Whitaker also interviewed Officer Rachel Turner, who had witnessed the entire event. Rachel's testimony was damning. "I tried to intervene," Rachel admitted. "I told him we should wait for backup and check her ID, but he wouldn't listen. He was convinced she was a threat because she didn't look like what he expected." Whitaker's team dug deeper into Matthews' record. Past complaints of excessive force and racially charged comments began to surface, painting a troubling picture of a man who had been protected by the system for too long. Meanwhile, Charlotte was recovering at a military hospital, her leg wrapped in thick bandages. Despite the physical pain, her resolve never wavered. Visits from her fellow soldiers and veterans lifted her spirits. "Colonel," Lieutenant Michael Harris, one of her closest colleagues, said during a visit, "We're all behind you. Whatever you need, we're here." Charlotte nodded, her expression serious. "This is bigger than me, Mike. What happened can't keep happening. Not to anyone. It's time we force a change." A week later, the FBI released its findings. The report concluded that Officer Matthews had acted with clear bias and violated multiple protocols. His decision to use deadly force against an unarmed individual, despite visible compliance, was deemed an egregious abuse of power. The next day, Matthews was formally charged with abuse of power, aggravated assault, and racially motivated misconduct. He was taken into custody, his mugshot plastered across national news. For Charlotte, the arrest was a step forward, but it wasn't enough. From her hospital bed, she issued a statement through her lawyer. "I'm grateful for the swift action taken against Officer Matthews, but this isn't just about one officer. This is about addressing the systemic failures that allowed this to happen. We need accountability, training, and reform to ensure no one else experiences what I did." Her words resonated deeply, igniting further discussions about police reform nationwide. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversation as people filed into their seats, eager to witness a trial that had captured the nation's attention. Officer Brian Matthews, now in a crisp suit but visibly nervous, sat at the defendant's table. Across the room, Charlotte Hayes, still walking with a slight limp, took her place among the witnesses. Her presence commanded respect, her military uniform a stark reminder of her service and sacrifice. The prosecution was prepared, armed with surveillance footage, witness statements, and an ironclad argument. Matthews had abused his power, acted with racial bias, and unnecessarily escalated a situation, resulting in grievous harm to an innocent woman. When it was her turn to testify, Charlotte walked to the witness stand, her posture straight despite the lingering pain in her leg. The courtroom fell silent as she was sworn in. "Colonel Hayes," The prosecutor began. Can you recount the events of that morning? Charlotte nodded, her voice calm but resolute. I was jogging through my neighborhood when I noticed a man attempting to break into a house. My instincts told me something was wrong, so I called the police and followed him to ensure he didn't get away. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain what happened, but they didn't listen. They assumed I was the criminal. Her words hung in the air, the weight of her experience palpable. When I complied with their orders, Officer Matthews escalated the situation further. Despite my repeated attempts to identify myself as a United States Army colonel, he refused to believe me, and then, without cause, he shot me in the leg. The prosecutor paused, letting the jury absorb her testimony. Colonel, how did this incident affect you? Charlotte's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Matthews before turning back to the jury. I've spent my entire career protecting this country, fighting for the rights and freedoms of every citizen. To be treated like a criminal in my own home, in my own neighborhood, simply because of the color of my skin, was more painful than the bullet wound. A murmur spread through the courtroom as her words sank in. Officer Rachel Turner, who had witnessed the shooting, was the next key witness. Her testimony was damning. I told him we should check her ID, Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with guilt. She wasn't resisting, and she complied with every order. But Matthews didn't listen. He was convinced she was a threat, and nothing I said could change his mind. The prosecution also presented the surveillance footage, which showed Charlotte kneeling on the ground with her hands raised before being shot. The visual evidence left little room for doubt. Additionally, the FBI investigation uncovered a troubling history of complaints against Matthews. Past incidents of excessive force and racially charged comments painted a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Matthews' defense attorney argued that his actions were the result of a high-pressure situation and that he believed Charlotte was reaching for a weapon. But the evidence undermined this claim at every turn. The prosecution highlighted that Charlotte had dropped the knife long before the shooting and had explicitly stated her identity multiple times. Officer Matthews wasn't acting under pressure, the prosecutor argued. He was acting under prejudice. He made an assumption based on race, and that assumption led to an innocent woman being shot. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Brian Matthews, guilty of aggravated assault, abuse of power, and racially motivated misconduct. Matthews visibly deflated as the verdict was read. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison, emphasizing the severity of his actions and the need for accountability in law enforcement. This case is a stark reminder, the judge said, that those entrusted with power must wield it responsibly. Officer Matthews failed to do so, and the consequences are clear. As the trial concluded, Charlotte felt a mixture of relief and determination. Justice had been served, but she knew this was just one battle in a much larger fight. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, microphones and cameras thrust forward. Colonel Hayes, do you feel justice was done today? One asked. Charlotte met their gazes, her voice steady. Justice isn't just about one verdict. It's about creating change so that no one else has to go through what I did. Today was a step in the right direction, but the work isn't over. Her words sparked applause from the crowd, many of whom carried signs supporting police reform and racial equality. Months after the trial, Charlotte Hayes stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, addressing an audience of veterans, activists, and community leaders. Behind her, a large banner read, "Justice through accountability, building a better tomorrow." Her voice carried across the room, firm and resolute. This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless others who face prejudice, abuse, and injustice simply because of who they are. It's time to turn pain into progress. The audience erupted in applause, but Charlotte's expression remained serious. She knew the fight for reform was far from over, and her journey was only beginning. Following the trial, Charlotte became a prominent voice for police reform and racial equality. She worked with lawmakers to push for policies that emphasized accountability, transparency, and cultural sensitivity in law enforcement. Key changes she advocated for included mandatory bias training, ensuring every officer underwent rigorous training to address implicit bias and prevent racial profiling. Body camera accountability, stricter enforcement of body camera usage, with severe penalties for tampering or failure to comply. Civilian oversight committees, establishing independent boards to review cases of misconduct and ensure transparency in investigations. Her influence extended beyond the courtroom and into Congress, where her testimony helped shape national legislation aimed at reducing police violence and fostering trust between law enforcement and communities. For Charlotte, the journey was as personal as it was professional. The physical wound in her leg healed with time, but the emotional scars lingered. She sought therapy, supported by a network of friends and colleagues who stood by her through every step. Her mornings were no longer solitary jogs through quiet streets. Instead, they were often spent meeting with young people, veterans and community members who looked to her for guidance and inspiration. One afternoon, during a visit to a local high school, a student approached her nervously. "Colonel Hayes," the student began, clutching a notebook, "your story inspired me. I want to join the military someday, to make a difference like you." Charlotte smiled warmly. "Then promise me one thing. Lead with integrity. Always remember that your power should protect, not harm." The impact of Charlotte's case rippled across the country. Protests turned into town hall meetings, where citizens and law enforcement came together to discuss solutions. Police departments began implementing reforms, and recruitment practices were overhauled to prioritize character and community engagement. Charlotte was invited to speak on national platforms, sharing her story and advocating for lasting change. On a popular news program, the host asked her, "Colonel Hayes, looking back on everything, do you feel like you've won?" Charlotte paused, her gaze steady. "Justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about building a world where people don't have to fear those who are meant to protect them. That work isn't done yet, but I'm proud to be part of the change." Years later, Charlotte's efforts bore fruit. A groundbreaking police reform bill, nicknamed the Hayes Act, was passed into law, mandating stricter accountability measures nationwide. Her case became a staple in law enforcement training programs, taught as a cautionary tale of what happens when prejudice overtakes professionalism. Despite the accolades and recognition, Charlotte remained grounded. To her, the real victory was in the conversations she sparked and the lives she touched. One quiet morning, as she sat on her porch overlooking Crestwood Heights, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain, the fight, the triumph. It had all shaped her into a stronger, more resolute advocate for justice. The fight wasn't over, but Charlotte Hayes, a soldier, a survivor, and a symbol of hope, was ready for whatever came next.